Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar, delivering an electricity system ready for future needs, next steps for upgrading vital infrastructure and implementing connections reform. Quite a mouthful, but a lot to cover. For those that don't know me, my name is Barney Wharton. I am Head of Grid and Flexibility at Renewable UK. We're the trade association for the UK's wind, power, tidal storage and flexibility infrastructure. And I'm delighted to be hosting today's Waterfront conference. Today's discussion comes at a really critical time. Last week, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, we secured over 8 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity in CFD allocation round 7. And this takes the total operational and contracted pipeline to around 35 gigawatts. So that's just 8 gigawatts short of the clean power ambition set out last year by the government. We're still awaiting the results for onshore and solar, but there's no doubt that that is also going to drive forward deployment and get us closer to those clean power goals. But there's little point in building all this new capacity if we can't get the power from that generation to the grid and then get it from that point of connection to where it's needed. So building new infrastructure, delivering connections reform is central to the Clean Power Mission. And I'm sure everyone here is aware that we've gone through a huge period of change and reform in the connections process. Projects themselves will have heard kind of where they are in sort of the particular buckets. But still awaiting details and actually how those connections will be delivered. And this will be make or break for many projects. So a huge amount going on and a huge amount to discuss. And this morning we've got an excellent panel lined up to lead us through what is going on. Charles Deacon is Managing Director of Eclipse Power Solutions. He has nearly a decade of experience in grid connections and electromagnetic compatibility, which is something slightly new to me. But he leads on upstream connections for large customers, focusing on making the connections process simpler and more transparent for everyone involved. Kay Laidlow Singh is a Senior Associate at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, specializing in energy and infrastructure. She advises developers, investors, and governments on complex projects and regulatory change, including grid connections and connections reform for the UK electricity system. Dr. Arshad Khan is the Grid Connections Manager at Cubico's Sustainable Investments, with a deep expertise in connecting onshore wind, solar, and battery storage projects. He has a background spanning academia and industry and specializes in flexible connections, network planning, and finding practical solutions to enable the energy transition. And then finally, I hope we are going to be joined by Kieran Savage, who's Customer Connections Manager at Greengen Cymru. He brings a decade of experience across distribution and transmission grid connections, working closely with NESO and developers to deliver clear and efficient connection pathways. So an excellent panel lined up for us. And if you do enjoy this morning's sessions, please do sign up for Connecting Projects to the Grid 2026, which will be taking place on the 9th of June at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer in London. And registration is opening, I believe, today, and the email will be sent out shortly. Finally, this morning's session will be recorded and shared after the event. But in the meantime, if you have any questions this morning for the panel, please do use the Q&A function, and we'll take those as we go through and at the end as well. So don't hold back and get those questions in early, and we'll try and deal with as many as we can. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Charles to kind of give us his perspective on connections reform and delivering infrastructure. Over to you, Charles.
Thanks, Barney. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Charles Deacon. I head up Eclipse Power Solutions, which is our grid consultancy business within the Eclipse Power Group. Eclipse Power is a network-focused group of companies. Primarily, we are an IDNO, so we have a license to operate distribution systems in England and Wales, up to 132 and 33 in Scotland. So that's typically contestable works in your connection. We also have a number of contracts directly with transmission for new grid supply points. We also have a private networks business, developing, owning, operating and funding private networks and microgrids to sort of co-locate demand and generation behind the meter and keep those green electrons, if you like, within sort of the local area for local customers. And then the grid consultancy business where I sit We also manage the upstream connections process for our larger customers connecting to the IDNO, so your batteries, your solar farms, your data centers, projects like that. So reform, I mean, I've been involved since very early on. I think the first meeting I went to was back end of 2022. As I think we sort of have a bit of a unique perspective on this. As I say, we have a number of contracts for grid supply points directly with NESO, where we act as the DNO. So we have been, checking evidence, making a submission to NESO, being involved in development of those processes, whilst also supporting customers connecting to the existing DNO networks. As well embedded within that. So we kind of see it from the customer side and the network side, I think, which is quite a good perspective to have. I must say, I'm very proud of the industry and everything that's been done to date to get to where we are. It's felt like a bit of a long slog at times, but I remember those first meetings we had back in 2022. Everything that was off the table is now in the methodologies. So, we were talking about we can't preference certain technology types, we can't have planning as a determinant and things like that. Now that's all in there, and I think it's really shown what we can do as an industry if we actually put our collective will to it, and sort of tame the market, which was a little bit out of control, shall we say, and send a clear signal as to what we need as a nation and to progress towards our decarbonisation goals. So I think that's been really, really laudable. We are definitely not finished with it. I think we're probably actually just starting the hard work now. Which is the queue formation and the offer issuing and the network studies, etc. There has been some teething problems on the way, namely the portal issues, which are well publicised, which caused an extension to the window. I think maybe some of the methodologies could have been a bit clearer to people, and I think there is a question over is just land rights really a good determinant of readiness. I think all of that will be on the table now when we're discussing opening a new window, hopefully later this year, for new applicants. But what it has shown is that there's a big buoyant market for renewable energy in the UK, with many of these quotas being oversubscribed. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan that will be published later this year, hopefully, which will look again at the 2035 quotas and also look ahead past that for our energy needs. I think the elephant in the room is probably data centers, which has really sprung up in the last couple of years. Again, that's probably going to now be the next oversubscribed market. And I know NESO and Ofgem are looking at what measures can be put in place to apply similar connections reform principles to the demand queue. So I think that's something that we need to keep an eye out for. And this kind of holistic network design, one model once and offer once, hopefully, will guide the network investment that we need for the future. So whereas before it was very reactive, first come, first served, it wasn't joined up. Now we should be able to have a right-sized network, which obviously keeps bills down for customers and also allows us to connect that generation. So that will be the next challenge. In terms of where we need that reinforcement, I think it will be dictated by these studies. I think we're now moving to a world, fortunately, where we're looking at preemptive reinforcement and preemptive investment. Since privatisation, the networks have been incentivised not to invest, which I think it has set us back probably 15 years from where we actually need to be. So now we're sort of playing catch up in that 5-year period now to 2030, which is going to have a material impact on people's bills in terms of tenure. So I think we do also need to look at an equitable way of recovering that cost due to the kind of inertia that we've had over the last 15 years. The England-Scotland border is a great example. There's only 2 circuits between those two, and we're paying a lot of money every year to curtail wind farms in Scotland because we can't get the power to where the load is. So I think we need to look again at Connect and Manage, which is the product that was brought in to allow generation to connect ahead of reinforcement and pay a constraint. We need to look whether that's still value for money, and we need to look at where we actually encourage generation to connect. We're not going to have zonal pricing now. We have some pricing signals with the network charge, but the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan should hopefully put all those things together. So we have generation in an area where the planning environment is good, the local community is supportive, and we're also near load. Because there's no point in zoning an area for generation because it's good for grid, but it might not be good for planning. And I think that's an approach that the Welsh government tried to do a few years ago, and it kind of fell down at that first hurdle. And finally, I think there needs to be a bit more investment at the transmission distribution interface. I think one of the biggest surprises of reform was the lack of advancement for DNO customers. It was kind of assumed that a lot of DNO customers would advance because the quotas at distribution were so high. However, the TOs decided that they couldn't advance the projects in that time. So that solar capacity in particular was substituted to transmission, which allowed some perhaps less ready transmission projects to actually get into phase one, which I think was a surprise to many. I remain sceptical whether some of these large DCO solar projects are necessarily appropriate for the areas, and also whether they can be delivered in time. But I guess we'll have to see on that. And just one more point. Now we need to look at delivery. Delivery is always going to be a challenge. We not to be alarmist, but I think we will struggle with the skill set and supply chain we currently have in the country. Getting a transformer from Siemens might take you a couple of years. You join the queue with the rest of Europe. We need to look at building a manufacturing base in this country, but also flexing the technical standards, looking at other suppliers. The current incumbent network operators are very rigid in what they will accept. And again, that's a benefit of independents like Eclipse. We can take a more pragmatic engineering view on the equipment we will accept on our network. And at transmission, we also need to see more openness to competition, particularly for the last mile of connections. So we'd like to see an independent transmission owner model as well for these 400 kV transformers and circuits, which are going to be owned by the generators. And presently, the way the rules are written, if you're a demand-only customer like a data center, you're not allowed to own those HV assets because it's licensable. That means we've got to wait for National Grid to build a new grid supply point, feed these AI growth zones, which can be 500 megawatts at 132, which doesn't make good engineering sense, and also wait till the queue is as long as the road before they will, spring into action to trigger the need for that grid supply point. And even then, it said it will take them 7 years. We believe that the private market can move a lot quicker, can build those grid supply points and feed customers at the voltage of their choosing. We're very pleased to see that DESNZ are now consulting on this as part of their AI growth zone plans to allow customers to A, build assets for the TO to adopt, or B, build what they call high voltage assets and retain ownership themselves, which we think will really help speed up the process and get more people connected to the grid. I guess that's the opening gambit, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Huge amounts to unpack in that. I'm sure we'll get into lots of it later. Kate, over to you. Kind of what are your thoughts and reflections on where we're at?
Thanks, Barney. As mentioned at the beginning, I'm Kate Laidlow Singh, and I'm a senior associate in the corporate energy team of the law firm Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer. And we've spent a lot of time, particularly over the past 18 months, advising a range of clients, be they developers, investors, or funders, on the connections reforms as they've evolved. And that's ranged from advising clients on preparing for and submitting their applications for Gate 2 connection agreements so that they're best placed to receive Gate 2 connection offers, checking their evidence, making sure that they're where they expect to be, mitigating the risks, advising from the changing requirements as the reforms developed and, particularly the protection categories and things changed, and that affected, what projects thought they would be able to benefit. Sort of due diligence of assets that are going through current M&A or funding processes that have been made quite a lot more challenging over the last few months, few years by the timing of the reforms and how to structure sort of equity and debt funding requirements so that those risks can be mitigated. And I'd say that most of our clients overall have been broadly supportive of what the reforms are trying to achieve, i.e., a smaller queue that's made up of projects that are viable and contribute to what the country needs in terms of the electricity generation mix. So there's been a lot of positivity there, but there has also been a huge amount of change for industry to keep up with in a short period of time as the regime developed, which I think the industry has done really well at keeping up with and adjusting to. And there has been a lot of uncertainty to contend with, both for projects at the development stage and also operational projects that are looking to make changes and how that fits in. And that uncertainty has had a significant impact on the ability of projects to progress and obtain further funding. In the past couple of years, with many of those that have progressed now having sort of we're seeing different new CPs, valuation adjustment mechanisms, termination rights in transaction documents to reflect sort of the uncertainty around getting that final connection offer. And I think it's also resulted in a sort of a flurry of activity with developers, seeking to sort out their option agreements for sufficient land and submit planning permissions before the first application window closed in August last year. And it'll be interesting to see whether we have sort of similar flurries before future rounds. I think looking ahead to the rest of 2026. Although we've had the initial results of the Gate 2 to whole queue process announced in December, there's still going to be a considerable period of uncertainty for many projects during 2026. And I think, like Charles said, we're definitely not at the end yet and nowhere near that. And I think until projects receive their actual Gate 2 modification offers from NESO or their DNO, they won't know the full revised terms of what's being offered. And so for post 2027 projects that aren't fully protected, that means they won't know their, for example, their new connection date until then. And when that offer is expected depends on when they're due to connect. But some projects won't receive those offers until the end of Q3, so it's still quite some time away. So projects are going to have to find ways to deal with that further period of uncertainty, where it could be difficult to get some further funding or sell, delays in progressing development or being able to get the supply chain contracted before they know those details. I think in terms of queue results, on the whole, not too many surprises compared to what was expected. We've had some projects that are expected to be in phase 1 that have been included in phase 2. I think it's difficult to tell what the actual impact of that will be until those modification offers are received with the connection dates in, and see what the final result is. I think it was a bit of a surprise to see this pretty limited advancement of projects from phase 2 to phase 1. I think it was 3 gigawatts that have been advanced, given that sort of the acceleration of viable projects was one of the drivers for the reforms. So I think it'd be interesting to see whether there will be any significant advancement within the phases as part of the network design process that's currently being run by the network companies. And I think, as Charles mentioned, I agree, demand is a bit of the elephant in the room. There was a huge leap in applications for demand connections at transmission level, from just a few gigawatt that are currently being built out to, I think it's around 100 gigawatts that's now been included in the connections queue up to 2035, with data centers being, a large proportion of those. So as Charles said, Ofgem have already said that demand connections is the next area for reform. So interesting to see where that leads to. And I think 2026 is also going to see so the viability of lots of projects being reconsidered, which will be the case for projects that have changed to an indicative Gate 1, but also a number of the projects that have achieved Gate 2 status. Those Gate 2 offers are going to have to be accepted and signed pretty quickly once they've received, particularly for distribution connections. And those terms might be significantly different from what was originally offered, including a later connection date or a different point of connection potentially, and revised works. And developers are going to have to make sure that those terms, line up with the terms of other project documents. So, for example, is the option agreement for the land going to be sufficient, or does that need to be extended? Does it all work? So I think there's going to be quite a lot of work around that this year, and some projects falling out where that doesn't all stack up. There's also things like securities requirements that may be considerably increased for projects once they've got their Gate 2 offer, given that they've been frozen now for the last, for the duration of the connections reform period. And those are going to need to be put in place, and people will think about whether that's worth it on that new offer. I think we're also very aware that projects will need to be thinking about their new revised queue management milestones once they've accepted an offer, that they'll need to keep up with those in order to keep their Gate 2 offer once it's accepted. And for some of those, the time periods are pretty tight. So for example, for projects that haven't yet submitted planning permission, there's a really short time period to initiate planning to meet milestone 1. So they need to be confident of meeting that deadline, and also aware that NESO could introduce the project commitment fee if lots of projects are being terminated, so additional security requirements in place. So I think for a number of reasons, the results notified in December, won't reflect the final queue that comes out the first application round, and there will be some attrition, and that will be something which we'll have to wait and see where we get to with the queue. And for projects that have received Gate 1 notification, or new projects that weren't in the first round, some of those will be looking towards the next rounds. I think NESO said that will be in Q2 at the earliest, but wait and see whether that's considerably later once the first application rounds finished. And I think there will be opportunities for projects to obtain Gate 2 offers, depending on which technology they are and where they are. And also some protections will apply, and those protections are different from the previous ones. But there is an opportunity for those projects that have subsequently obtained planning or have things like a CFD or capacity market contract. So I think lots to think about at the start of 2026. Still, again, a long way from saying connections reform's done. And I also agree with Charles that we need to ensure that the network is built out so that those new connection offers can be met and the projects don't face further delays in getting connected.
Great, thank you, Kate. Even more to unpack there. Let's go over now to Arshad. Have we lost Arshad?
No, I'm here.
Oh, there we go. Great, off you go. Sorry, you just been off my screen.
No worries. Yeah, thanks, Barney, and morning, everyone. My name is Arshad. I'm a Grid Connection Manager working in the Cubico Sustainable Investment Development team. So yeah, as my other colleagues, Kate and Charles has alluded to connection reforms, I'm going to focus mainly on connection reforms. The initial outcome so far we have, what has improved and what challenges and risks are still there, and we need to manage those to make sure that we get the benefit which were intended of this whole exercise which we have done in the last few years. So I think one thing which connection reform has done is that we would sort of end up with much more credible queue. So as we all know that initially the queue was like there was more than 700 gigawatt of generation waiting to be connecting, and there was an exponential increase which were not sustainable, and we couldn't just continue the way things were going. So this was an important step, and it has up to a certain extent make sure that queue is manageable, it's much more credible, we have more visibility of the projects which are likely to be delivered. And the stringent queue management milestones which NESO and ENA has introduced, it will help to keep that queue in shape in the coming years as well. Another thing, connection reforms, which is a positive side of the connection reform, is that it will help increasing, unlocking increased network investment. And I think we have seen that from the RIIO-T3 plan as well, that I think there is more than £60 billion being committed to invest in networks in the next 5 years, which is a positive improvement. The DNOs are currently working on their ED3 plan, and they have now much more visibility of the network needs, and they can even build ahead of need as well. So this whole exercise will reduce the risk of under or overbuilding network assets. In terms of investors, it give much more certainty because these Gate 2 offers, the hope is that it will give much more confidence on the connection timelines, the network readiness, and it help investor to efficiently allocate capital and portfolio prioritization. So there are some strong investment signals which we hope that we can get as an outcome of these connection reforms. Another important aspect of connection reforms, in my view, is that strategic network planning. So as we see that, we know that SSEP is being developed, and I think it's going to be published next year. CSNP, TRES, all this coordinated network planning is important, and connection reforms sort of feed into that. It helps you where the network is needed, and that long-term system development is supported through connection reforms. So in overall, I would say connection reforms have improved the queue quality, it increased investment confidence, it will lead into strategic network planning. But there are certain issues which we still need to consider, and there are challenges and risks which are arising as an outcome of these connection reforms. So one thing which I would like to highlight is the oversubscription of BIS throughout the country. So from NESO and DISNIS, capacity allocation for BIS, we know that they said that I think we need around 28 gigawatt of BIS by 2035, but we ended up with having around 90 gigawatt of BIS with Gate 2 offers. And interestingly, almost 100% of that BIS is protected. which means that although there might still be attrition, but that would be very small because it's already being consented. And in fact, the NESO future energy scenario says that we need 40 gigawatt of BIS by 2050, but we might end up with having, double up that by 2035. So it's not only the oversubscription, it has, it will lead into other consequences as well. It's not strategically, we will end up with having BIS in non-strategic locations. Another thing is that it may crowd out and delays other technologies which has higher system value, such as solar and wind. So this is one thing which I would say the protections were not properly designed, and we ended up in this situation, and it will have consequences in the coming years. On the other side, if we look at solar and onshore and offshore wind, more than 50% of the projects with Gate 2 offers are not consented, which means there will be huge attrition. We know that the planning success rate in the country is not great, although the current government is trying to remove some of the red tapes, which will hopefully improve the timeline and the success rate. But still, more than 50% of solar, onshore wind, and BIS are not consented. There will be attrition, but NESO hasn't built any attrition in the queue. So, for example, if we end up with projects failing to progress through planning, there will be gaps created in the queue, but there is no backup plan. You cannot simply ask a Gate 1 projects to come and fill that gap, because you need 2-3 years to reach that planning stage. So I think there will be gaps created, and we might end up with failing meeting that Clean Power 2030 targets. Another important aspect to highlight is that as we have seen that a lot of embedded projects were not progress to phase 1, and embedded capacity were allocated to transmission projects. And I think that was due to limited coordination between the different parties, such as DESNZ, NESO, and the network companies, when they allocated this capacity. And we may end up with have project having a Gate 2 offer, but it might not be commercially viable due to either high grid cost or due to high curtailment. So these are the risks which we still need to look after, and to make sure that we manage these risks. In terms of the zonal allocation, particularly for onshore wind, we know that Scotland is oversubscribed, while on the other hand, in England and Wales, it's undersubscribed. And NESO decided not to reallocate that onshore wind capacity from England and Wales to Scotland. The justification behind that was that when NESO did the cost-benefit analysis, they thought that reallocating that capacity to Scotland will have a detrimental impact on the constrained cost, and which is true. But one thing which is we don't have any visibility of what they considered in that CBA, because you cannot simply compare onshore wind in Scotland to onshore wind in England and Wales, because developing onshore wind in England and Wales is much harder. It has higher development cost, low yield, and a lot of constraints. So 1 megawatt in Scotland is not equivalent to 1 megawatt in England and Wales. So we don't know, when they did that CBA, did they only based it on the constraint cost, or did they consider the development cost, the constraints, the yield, and all those factors? Because in the short term, we might end up with reducing that constraint cost, but in the long run, it will be much more costly to have onshore wind in England and Wales. So that imbalance is there, and I think that's something which needs to be considered as well. So to conclude, I would say connection reforms have definitely laid a strong foundation, but we still need to address delivery risk, this misallocation, the coordination issues, and regional imbalances, to make sure that the system is truly ready for the future energy needs. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Even more to unpack in that as well. Please do put questions that you may have to the panel into the Q&A. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It'd be kind of great to understand what people want to hear more about. But in the meantime, Kieran, sort of final thoughts from you, and then we'll get into a discussion.
No worries, thank you. Thanks for having me today. Really pleased to be part of the panel. So I'm Kieran Savage. I'm the Customer Connections Manager at Green Gen Cymru. For those who aren't familiar, Green Cymru are an IDNO based in Wales. We were granted our licence in early 2024, and we are currently responsible for designing, consent and building around 300 kilometres of 132 kV infrastructure across various structures for our generation customers who are predominantly onshore wind in Wales. These are not kind of small upgrades, but what we do need is a kind of strategic approach to build out and unlock the grid capacity in Wales. So our mission is to support Clean Power 2030, as well as the Welsh Government targets at 2035. In order to do this, I think as an industry, we need to be kind of flexible and timely in delivering modern infrastructure, potentially something that traditional DNOs and TOs have struggled with, and hence the kind of reason for connections reform kind of coming around to solve that. And also the importance of IDNOs like ourselves and Eclipse as an alternative to the incumbent DNOs and TOs to help bring that plan forward. I also think it's really important for us to be as innovative as possible to support the delivery of connections reform, given the kind of tight timescales and the big ask that we've got across the industry. As an example of this, at Green Cymru, we are looking at utilising a different type of conductor, so a CCC conductor across our overhead line schemes. So to use this high tension, low sag conductor, it's kind of looking to use a higher capacity along the same structures. So you're increasing the efficiency of the lines, but you're still minimising any visual impact to the local areas, which sort of feeds into your planning and consenting regimes. As part of connections reform, Green Gen have been heavily involved in the connections reform hub meetings across various work streams to ensure that IDNOs and Wales are represented to ensure that our needs and concerns are addressed appropriately. And kind of similarly to other IDNOs, we've been involved in the receiving of the evidence submissions, reviewing that evidence and submitting that via NESO. So kind of really involved at the sharp end of that. Probably one of the challenges I've been fourth in the panel is a lot of the ground's been covered in terms of some of the challenges that I was looking to raise. But I think one of the main things, obviously, connections reform is something that's been very needed over the last kind of number of years with almost the staleness of the connections queue, where there's a lot of projects that will sit kind of stagnant for a number of years without progressing, and at the detriment of our customers who are actually ready. But I think although it is a really big ask to progress with connections reform and the kind of wide reform also that's carried out in terms of connections, the prolonged uncertainty around the process is something that has been a big challenge, I think, for both the network companies and the customers. Obviously, with delays to the timescales for offers coming out, it is something that provides a lot of uncertainty for customers. And the example of there's a lot of money at risk in terms of kind of generators who can't commit to progressing with the project until they get their Gate 2 offers. Queue formation was really positive in terms of getting that Gate 2 outcome, Phase 1 or Phase 2 outcome, but there's still quite a broad scale or a broad window of where customers are actually going to connect, and they'll not have that certainty until they receive their Gate 2 offers. In addition to that, I think Kate mentioned that in terms of the securities, there's still a number of Gate 1 projects which are sitting with securities, sitting with the NESO or via their DNO or IDNO, which they may be struggling to progress on or developing other projects while this money's kind of held up and within the Gate 1 offer. Although they've been identified as Gate 1 back in December, they're still almost waiting for that security to be released, which is a bit of a challenge for those customers. I think one of the concerns that we have, along with many other customers and network companies, is due to the delays to the timescales for the delivery of these offers. You're almost squeezing the time at the far end for when those offers are issued. If there's any concerns or queries or potential errors that are in the offers, there's that limited timescale of that challenge period or query period to make sure that those offers are correct before they're signed. And I think, again, that was kind of touched on, that timescale for accepting these offers is going to be pretty limited. Again, feeding into that, sorry to kind of go over ground that Kate's mentioned again, but one of the big concerns that I had highlighted was in the round of the queue management milestones and how that's implemented post acceptance of the Gate 2 offers. I think what we really want to try and avoid is getting back into a situation which was the reason we needed connections reform, where you've got projects that aren't actively progressing and how you actually manage them. I think the challenge with the way the queue management process is looking to be implemented is, one, the tight timescales for submitting planning. Obviously, there's a lot of these projects have effectively been on hold until they get their Gate 2 offers, and then how quickly they're expected to turn around and submit that planning. And I think the way that it's almost worded in terms of the challenge to the queue management milestones is that if you can demonstrate that these issues or delays are out with your control, then there's a place to challenge that. So there's the risk of being very quickly back into a situation where customers aren't meeting their milestones, are not actively progressing, but they're providing just enough information to demonstrate that it's not within their control. And I think another point to highlight around the queue management milestones is the application of these milestones to DCO and DNS projects, which heavily impact our customers. And within that, there's the wording in the queue management guidance of these would be bespoke agreements between the DNOs and IDNOs and the customer. So it's how you kind of get around that fairness approach for various customers if they're going down a local consenting regime versus the kind of DCO or DNS. So kind of a couple of points on the queue management side of things. And again, I think there's feeding from the queue management stuff back into the consenting regimes. I think that's quite a big challenge that's going to be faced across the industry, not just for customers, but also the network companies. And I think it's just going back to that uncertainty around timescales. Sometimes they'll be they'll kind of fit to your kind of standard timescales for a consenting process. Other times, due to resource constraints or what have you, that might linger on for a year beyond when it's supposed to. So I think probably maybe not for the network companies, but for the planning regimes and the kind of wider strategic spaces to kind of look at how we can streamline the consenting process and remove some of those blockers to progress with connections reform and the big delivery programme that we do have. And I think that was the kind of bulk of what I'd say without kind of going over the detail of what's been mentioned previously. I think connections reform's been a great thing to be brought in. I think it was needed across the industry to progress those sort of real projects. But again, maybe touching on the point of what Charles mentioned earlier, as land rights maybe the best way to demonstrate readiness. Should there have been more evidence required to progress, and then that maybe would have streamlined the queue a little bit more. But yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges ahead, but we're certainly moving in the right direction. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you. And ending on a positive note there, which is great. Thank you. So as I say, if you have any questions for the panel, please do use the Q&A function to submit those. But while you have a think about that and type away, I wanted to pick up on a few things that came up in that conversation. I think the first thing is, I mean, Charles, you started making the point that this has been a long process. The first conversations were back in 2022. So kind of 4 years at this, and it's been a long period of uncertainty. And then, Kate, as you were saying, some people are going to be waiting until the back end of this year to get their kind of final offer. I mean, I'm kind of interested, what impact has that had on the sector? That kind of just long period of uncertainty, not being able to progress this project. Has this been detrimental? And how do you think, with some degree of ongoing uncertainty, projects and developers can kind of maintain momentum? Kind of interested in kind of thoughts on that. Charles, kick off with you.
Yeah, so it's taken a long time, and I think every time we sort of agreed on a solution, it was maybe not ambitious enough, so it was added to, and then the new government came in 2024 and sort of put it on steroids. I think as an industry, we're very good at open democracy. I sit on a number of code working groups as well. It can slow things down. So sometimes I think we're too scared of picking winners and losers. I think that's now we've moved on from that and we're ready to progress. But yes, it has caused a lot of uncertainty. I think particularly the delays over the summer, particularly people with near-term connection dates, even with protections, because while you have the protection where theoretically things won't change, I think because of the delays and the issues with the portal, the trust in the system, unfortunately, is very low. And the networks are working behind the scenes really hard on this and to get comfort out to customers as soon as possible, but also need to make sure that they get it right. So I think that, while protections are laudable, I don't think it's given customers or particularly investors the comfort they need to progress those near-term projects. So I think we're going to see some of these near-term dates probably missed either by the customer or the network operator or both, which is going to then put more pressure on the supply chain at the back end of the decade. And then secondly, you've got products like technical limits, which allow people to connect ahead of transmission works, which are great, but the way the queues formed and the studies will be studied on their firm date, so the customer won't have the full picture of their final solution and cost and connection date and whatnot by the time they're ready to connect the non-firm solution. So again, we have a bit of an impasse, and that is also currently under active discussion in work streams. So I think everyone's behind the driver of reform, and I think everyone agrees it is a good thing. But I think the kind of lack of information at times has been frustrating to customers and created some uncertainty.
Yeah, I agree that there were certainly some challenges over the summer which has undermined that confidence in the process. I mean, Kate, from your point of view, what are you saying to your clients about how to handle the kind of what has been going on, and then kind of what's coming next in terms of that kind of uncertainty and just sort of waiting for those offers?
I guess we've been trying to give them as much confidence as we can as the reforms evolved. So what did we know at each particular stage? How could you evaluate a project against those criteria, and building in mechanisms into transaction documents to provide some protection, particularly if those then changed as the process continued. Fortunately, most of the protections increased, so that helped certain projects that were closer to that were more progressed. But then obviously has it means that there's less space for those projects that are less progressed. So we have seen lots of new mechanisms being included in transaction documents and funding documents to help our clients get over that uncertainty and be able to bridge the gap. So I think we are seeing quite a few things being delayed, or completions of things or CPs being satisfied being delayed until we've got the point of having a final offer and having that full certainty. And the point at which that certainty is being given has definitely pushed back, and the timetable has pushed back. And I think that's something that would be really good to see not be pushed back further beyond the currently anticipated timeframes, because I think it is having a bit of a stifling effect on people being willing to fund. And there are definitely projects going through, but there's a lot more scrutiny on what could be obtained and when, and what's the backup if projects aren't getting what they expect.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting kind of what may happen certainly over the next few months with the kind of the detailed offers coming through and people understanding what exactly their connections are going to look like, and that may not be, as you were saying, quite what people are expecting, and how do you handle that as a developer? And a part of that, I guess, then leads into Arshad, the point you were making about milestones, and I think everyone kind of actually mentioned milestones in some way. I mean, are they going to work properly? And I think particularly the point Arshad you're making about BESS, we have a huge queue still of protected batteries on the system. I think there's a question about whether the market will deliver all that capacity. So what's going to happen there? And I guess do others have a view on what that battery queue may look like in the future? And are the milestones that have been introduced through this queue reform process going to help kind of manage that queue, and how then do we deal with that attrition, and are we doing enough there to then bring potentially other projects that are ready forward? Do you think we can handle that? So there's quite a lot in there. I guess the question is really, are the milestones going to work? Is that going to kind of drive forward delivery? And then how do we bring other projects that are perhaps more ready forward? Arshad, kind of any sort of further thoughts on that?
So I think those milestones are necessary to make sure that projects are progressing and they are on track, as was the case previously, because the network companies were not sort of implementing those milestones in true spirit, and there were projects being in the queue for like many years without progressing. So we needed to have some sort of mechanism to make sure that projects are progressing. But on the other hand, there are certain milestones which are very challenging to meet as well. For example, one of the milestones is that once you are consented, you have to agree your design with the network company within 6 months. Now, that means you have to appoint your ICP before you are consenting, and that introduce a huge risk, financial risk for the project. Those type of things are we need to make sure that these milestones are realistic. And another point you make is that if a project fails and drop out of the queue, can we just ask another project to come out? I think that would be very challenging, because generally speaking, it's if a project failed to progress to planning or not consented and that project drop out, it would be hard for a gate one project to replace that, because they wouldn't have progress until planning. No investor would invest millions of pounds to progress a project to planning without being that certainty of grid. So yeah, there are those type of risks, and I think NESO not being building any attrition into the queue means that we are risking meeting that clean power 2030 target.
Cool, thank you. I don't know anyone else wants to come on that point, but I guess maybe for Kieran and Charles, if we want to accelerate projects, yeah, I'm going to guess that you think there is an opportunity there for IDNOs to come and step in and help accelerate projects up the queue, rather than waiting for the TO or DNO to kind of do that work. And do you think, I'm guessing you do think there is a role for independent network and supply chain to come and help solve some of this problem?
Certainly, I'll just jump in quickly. So I think, we like to think we can move quicker. We know we can. We don't get paid until the connection is energized. We just earn GEOS revenue. We don't have a regulated asset base or anything like that. So, our incentive to get you connected as quickly as possible is as strong as yours. We can also take a pragmatic engineering viewpoint on something. If it's approved for use in the UK, it's fit for purpose, it fits your design. We can approve it. We can have a shared user customer and IDNO substation. We wouldn't insist on a separate substation. We might allow you to use aluminium cable where the DNO may want you to use copper. The DNO wants that standardization. They want that headroom in their network because they have tens of thousands of assets to look at. We have what's essentially a series of small isolated networks, so we can look at each one in isolation with our asset management and design teams. So yes. And I think aside from the IDNO, our private network proposition is also interesting. That's co-locating demand and generation behind a single connection point. We keep those, renewable electrons within that private network, which could provide a route to market to generators who maybe have failed to get a gate 2 offer. And that reduces power flow through the boundary meter, which reduces grid charges. Co-location is key. Electrical capacity is one thing, but physical space is another. The capacity factor of solar is around 14%. A 132 kV bay, you could take a couple of hundred MVA. Why are we sterilizing them with 50 megawatt solar farms? We need to use more of the same infrastructure to connect more projects. And at the moment, I don't necessarily think the legacy network operators are always geared up to think that way. Whereas that's sort of in our DNA, if you like.
Kieran.
Yeah, I think just to support the point that Charles made, particularly from previous roles and experiences with various customers, one of the challenges that was always raised was the lack of speed on the incumbent DNOs dealing with the design queries as they come in and allowing the projects to progress at pace. Obviously, with the incumbent DNOs, they've got a lot more infrastructure to be looking at in the kind of wider system approach. But I think certainly from an IDNO perspective, it's something that if it's technically feasible and it's something that's kind of reasonably practical that can work, then progress on that basis, and you're looking to make up some of that time. Whereas I think that's potentially a risk of connections reform the way it's going, that the queue management stuff's really heavily focused on the customer and what milestones they're going to meet. And I think some of the focus needs to be also put on the network companies and how they're kind of held to that same standard. And I think one of the points in the Q&A kind of raises that point just around what, maybe pressure's not the right word, but what parameters can be put in place to make sure that the TOs and the DNOs are working to the same tight timescales that the IDNOs and customers are expected to keep to.
Just to add to that really quickly, Ofgem is doing what they call an end-to-end connections review, which will put more contractual teeth, if you like, into offers to make DNOs and TOs keep their side of the bargain. There's a consultation that's open till the 22nd of Feb, so I'd encourage everyone to respond to that if they want to.
Cool, thanks. I guess question I wanted to ask then was, what lessons have we learned? I mean, we've been through this huge period of reform. This will be, I think, an ongoing process as we learn lessons of kind of how this new world works. And two questions within that. Kind of one, firstly, what should be the priority for NESO now? And part of that is when will, and the first question here, when do you think the next window is likely to open, and do you think that should be significantly different from the previous one? So kind of, sense of timescales and what lessons we should learn. Kate, I'll go to you on this one.
I think lessons learned, trying to ensure that the process is as smooth as possible. And as we mentioned before, some of the frustrations in terms of the actual application. So taking that forward for future rounds, trying to make that as smooth as possible and as pain-free as it can be. I think going forward for sort of future rounds, looking at the treatment of co-location and whether that should be looked at differently at the moment. As we mentioned, different technologies on the same site are treated separately. And so whether there should be a different treatment that better reflects the benefits of having co-located projects on system, the future. Demand, we've already mentioned, whether that should be treated differently, so that we don't end up in the same situation that we had with the generation queue in future, and then rerunning this whole exercise again in a few years because the demand queue is out of control. So I think those are sort of things that should be prioritised. In terms of date for the next round, NESO said no earlier than Q2 this year. I'd be surprised if that's run before. We've seen some more of the outcomes of this first round before the next application window, at least before it closes. I think it'd be difficult to run the network studies when we don't know what we've got from the first round. So my guess would be later in the year, hopefully still this year.
Cool. I mean, Arshad, from your point of view, kind of what lessons can we take from the process to date, and do you have a guess of when we might open the next window?
Yeah, I think one of the lesson learned is that I think NESO needs to make sure that those sort of clerical and logistical issues are resolved, like the portal issues and stuff. These are not directly relevant to connection reforms, but it's sort of as an industry, it's losing their trust in the NESO process and stuff. Another important thing was the lack of communication from NESO in most of the time. So that's very important as well. There were situations where you contact NESO and you have to follow it up every week, but you don't get a response. So that lack of communication, we need to make sure that in the next round, there is some sort of transparent and quick communication, so that as an industry we have that trust on the NESO to deliver this big task. We do understand that this is a huge challenge, and so just to work with the industry to make sure that things run smoothly in the next window. In terms of when that next window would be, I know that NESO says it would be no earlier than Q2 this year. But I don't think it would, it would be appropriate to have it in that time, because by that time, most of the customer wouldn't have seen their Gate 2 offer, neither they would have signed those Gate 2 offers. So we wouldn't know how much capacity is left for different technologies in different zones. At the moment, if we look at it right now, and if a window opens tomorrow, for example, most technologies doesn't have any capacity left. So there is no reason, no point in applying, putting a grid connection, a Gate 2 offer, a Gate 2 application forward, because if there is no capacity for onshore wind, for example, in Scotland, solar almost everywhere in the country, and same goes to BESS, for BESS. So it would make much more sense if that Gate 2 window opens once this first, process has been completed. All customers have their Gate 2 offer, they have signed and returned those offers. We will have much more clarity of the queue. How does the queue look like? What are the capacity situation in different parts of the country? And if at that time, if a new window opens, that would make, give customers much more clarity and visibility of their putting up their Gate 2 application.
Cool. Thank you. I just want to pick up a couple more questions in the Q&A. I mean, just the first one here. So from Will Barrett, given DCO planning and consent can take up to 3 years, and we've got the general election in 2029, so the timing there is pretty coincidental. Do we think, or how? Sorry, does the panel see changes in terms of developer approaches in the coming years? And I guess there is this question about kind of, yeah, there may be a change in government. There's some political challenges there, and how will people kind of manage that? Start thinking about that now. I mean, probably a difficult question to answer, but I kind of wonder what conversations people are having with their customers. Anyone want to take on that? Slightly political question, I guess.
I'll take the reins on that one. Try my best to answer that from a GreenGen perspective. From some of our projects, they're kind of still looking to kind of kick on in the kind of planning process to reduce that time post gate to offer as much as possible. But from our perspective on consenting the main lines that we have across Wales is something that we're regularly talking about in terms of this year, in terms of the Welsh Senedd elections, but obviously the upcoming elections in 2029, which some of those projects may be connecting across. So I think it's that point where you're almost trying to second guess what may happen, particularly in the Welsh elections, because they're coming up so soon. But I think that just kind of comes back to my wider point of there kind of needs to be that holistic approach from the kind of strategic spaces and as part of connections reform like SSEP, the TRESP, etc., to kind of try and put a bit of focus on how we can streamline the process for consenting, because what you want to avoid is a new government comes in every cycle that it completely drastically changes the process for consent. What we want to meet the targets is to have a consistent approach. Appreciating that may be difficult in some cases when you have various political parties and different aims, but I certainly think a more streamlined approach is something that's needed for the delivery of this.
Thank you. And anyone else wants to comment on that? If not, Charles.
I just quickly think we owe it all to ourselves in the industry to look the existential threat in the eyes and just keep pushing on. If we're progressing and economics will win out in the end. So I think we've got to back ourselves and keep going.
Cool. Thank you. Very quickly, there's a question here just about the kind of the value of the connections themselves. Can connections that pass Gate 2 be kept once obtained with the protections and be used in other ways, potentially by other developers or projects? My understanding is that no, your connection is for that project and for that developer, so you can't pass it on. And part of the purpose of connections reform was to kind of decommodify, I guess, connections. But is that correct? Anyone want to comment on that quickly?
Yeah, I think you've just hit the nail on the head. So there was a big trend over the summer of, can I turn my battery to a data center? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Your connection has a value for what's connected on the end of it. If you need to change it, that's a material change, and you could risk going to the back of the queue. I think, we want to avoid this secondary market of speculation of connections, and that's exactly what reform is meant to stamp out. So I'd agree with what you said.
Great, thank you. We've barely scratched the surface of this. Lots of questions that I still have, but we're coming up to the end of our session. I guess just very briefly from each of you on the panel, kind of what do you think we need to focus on next? Kind of where is the immediate action? What do people need to be thinking about? Just kind of any final reflections or thoughts very quickly. I'm going to start with Arshad.
Yeah, I think in just 2 words, we need much more clarity and certainty from NESO business and all stakeholders. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Kate.
I think getting the offers out quickly and making sure that what's in those offers is stuck to, and there aren't further delays in actually getting the connection.
Cool, thank you. Kieran.
Likewise, I think the timescales is something that's really important. Obviously, trying to make up for as much lost time as possible. The quicker we get the offers out, the quicker we get them signed, customers can crack on, and then we can get to the next window and the enduring process.
Good stuff. And Charles.
Yeah, focus on quality offers and speed, but also embedded demand. We need to make sure that demand system from these reforms, and currently that's been out of scope. So I think that needs looking at.
Demand is the next big thing. Great. Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you everyone for joining this morning. As I said at the start, the session has been recorded, so feel free to kind of watch again and catch up on things you may have missed. And do join the conference on the 9th of June, which you'll be hearing more about shortly. So please, just from me, a huge thank you to this excellent and very knowledgeable panel, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.